Greetings, Elamites, and welcome to the channel where I, a real-life lawyer, examine the laws of history. Today's topic, Ea Nasir, the dirty copper bandit. I recently saw a story about a company called Mercuria, saying that it was the victim of fraud. Mercuria had purchased a large amount of copper, $36 million worth. Upon its arrival, though, they were stunned to find that the copper that they ordered was not just of poor quality, but that it was actually pallets worth of painted rocks. Several angry letters were exchanged, a lawsuit was filed, and when all was said and done, 14 people wound up being arrested. Amazingly, the practice of sending angry letters dates back thousands of years to the Bronze Age. These people, living 5,000 years ago, were surprisingly literate. We have thousands of letters from them, most of which are written in these terse and jagged sentences and are absolutely hysterical once you translate them into the English language. As luck would have it, copper fraudsters also originated 5,000 years ago in the Bronze Age. The most famous of these letters and fraudsters involves one Nani, who was allegedly ripped off by a copper merchant named Ea Nasir. In fact, the Guinness Book of World Records recognizes it as the oldest ever customer complaint. So who is Ea Nasir? At some point, the internet collectively decided that this is him. It's not. We have no idea what he looked like, but everyone seems to agree, so let's just settle and say he is a handsome gentleman. Ea Nasir was from the city of Ur in around 1750 BC. It was there that he built his reputation as a powerful and successful copper salesman. Later, though, he began splitting his time between the city of Ur and the source of the copper, Dilmun. Dilmun is around modern-day Bahrain in the Arabian Peninsula, which is conveniently located to accept shipments of copper coming from the Indian Ocean. While he was in Ur, he would make contracts with his buyers, which were nearly all recorded in the Temple of Shamash, located in Ur, as Nani and other writers reference. After making the contracts, Ea Nasir would go himself to Dilmun and offload the copper to ship back to the city of Ur. How shipping works appears to have gone one of two ways. Either Ea Nasir would ship to you, or you would send your own caravan directly to Ea Nasir in Dilmun. Those who sent the caravans to Dilmun, like Nani, noting that Dilmun required a journey through enemy territory as referenced in the letter, which is a source of a lot of confusion for people online, would pay silver directly to Ea Nasir, collect the copper, and then go home. At some point, though, we know that Ea Nasir started spending too much time in Dilmun, because his business started going south, and it went south pretty fast. After this went on for a little while, we know that he retired from the copper trade entirely. He started trading in textiles and lesser valuable goods. He moved back to the city of Ur, and it looks like he brought the complaint letters back home with him, maybe for self-reflection or for nighttime reading. So with that background, I want to point out that this story isn't what it seems to be. Although he was a horrible businessman, I think in this instance, Ea Nasir was right. But without further ado, let's look at the letter itself. Tell Ea Nasir, Nani sends the following message. When you came, you said to me as follows. I will give Gimmelson fine quality copper ingots. You left then, but you did not do what you promised me. You put ingots which were not good before my messenger and said, if you want to take them, take them. If not, go away. What do you take me for that you treat somebody like me with such contempt? I sent messengers, gentlemen like ourselves, to collect the bag with my money, but you have sent them back empty-handed several times, and that through enemy territory. Is there anyone among the merchants who trade with Dilmun who has treated me in this way? You alone treat my messenger with contempt. On account of that one trifling mean of silver which I owe you, you feel free to speak to me in such a way, while I have given the palace on your behalf 1,080 pounds of copper. And how have you treated me for that copper? You have withheld my money from me in enemy territory, and now it is up to you to restore my money to me in full. Take cognizance that I from now on will not accept here any copper from you that is not of fine quality. I shall now select and take the ingots individually in my own yard, and I shall exercise against you my right of rejection because you have treated me with contempt. There is a lot to unpack here. So before we get into the law, let's talk about how these things actually worked, because I've read article after article and watched video after video regarding these tablets and letters, but very few people take the time to explain how the Bronze Age economy actually operated. So, me not being an expert, here's what I've come up with. First, there were no coins or money as we know them today. Instead, people traded in these minas and talents of precious metals and also traded in raw materials, also known as bartering. We're going to start with bartering and then we'll talk about trade with the precious metals. Locally, everyday people bartered with exchange rates set by the laws. If you watched our other videos on the origins of Bronze Age law, you'd see that the law codes of the time generally set the prices of commodities. For example, the laws of Eshnunna, which were written not too long before Ea Nasir and Hammurabi, set the price at 3 minas of copper at 1 shekel of silver. A mina at that time was equivalent to about 1¼ pounds in our weight measurements today, so almost 4 pounds of copper would be worth a shekel. A shekel is 1/60th of a mina of silver. These values are going to be important later for when we put Nani's complaint into context. So to barter, you would trade an item of equivalent value. Take this for instance. Eshnunna's laws also say that 6 minas of wool are worth a shekel of silver. So in theory, because 6 minas of wool and 3 minas of copper are worth the same, you could trade 6 minas of wool and 3 minas of copper. Again, this is how the everyday person traded for barley, wheat, beer, so on and so forth. The alternative was to pay 3 minas of copper with 1 physical shekel of silver. Now, I shouldn't have to tell you that living in the Bronze Age wasn't exactly safe. You had bandits, Elamites, witches, sea peoples, and if you subscribe to ancient mythology, you have gods playing all sorts of tricks on man and running off with their wives and kinfolk. In the words of Dr. Eric Klein, the author of 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, I would not survive for more than 24 hours, but it would be a great 24 hours. And that pretty much sums it all up. So, this begs the question, where do you put money so that it's safe? Because you don't want to be walking around with it. The answer is the temple, a secure place that was typically under guard by government-hired officials. Hammurabi's code makes reference to temple guards and imposed the death penalty on anyone who dared to steal from a temple. Temples were, therefore, the first banks, and under Hammurabi's code, robbing a bank was subject to capital punishment. Indeed, we have letters from later Babylonian kings who reserved for themselves jurisdiction over all temple robbery cases. They would hear the cases and decide them directly, without interference from the governors or from lower judges. So, we have a place to keep the money. But how does it get deposited, and how does it get moved around? Because they didn't have credit cards and they didn't have the internet. But they did have clay tablets. Either the temple itself would loan the money to somebody with a debt note, inscribed on a clay tablet of course, or somebody would deposit precious metals in the temple and then issue a debt note to another person. The note would say, I hereby loan so-and-so X amount of silver. The silver would never leave the temple. That's the key part. It would just be put on the other person's account for use. Then, the other person would repay the silver directly to the temple to balance his account. In this way, we get the first debt and credit transactions, and priests become the first bookkeepers and accountants. The temples, when they loaned out money directly, would collect interest on those loans, and they also collected taxes. So they would use the income to purchase raw materials, engage in international trade, make weapons, so on and so forth. But this raises an issue. Ea Nasir was no small-town copper junkie. He was an international merchant. How does one deal on credit internationally? The good news is, it's pretty simple. It's more or less in the same way. In this case, we know that Nani paid Ea Nasir in silver directly. It's possible that Nani took a business loan from the temple on his own behalf for minas of silver, which he would then trade for copper. Then, to make good on his own personal loan, he would deposit the copper in the temple. Ea Nasir wouldn't repay the temple directly because Nani's the one who took out the loan. Alternatively, if Nani, let's say, was flush with cash, he was a wealthy merchant and his house was full of minas of silver, he could pay Ea Nasir directly, but would still provide the contract to the temple to record it. Because if the contract were to be breached, Nani would have to go to the temple with his witnesses to sue Ea Nasir. With that out of the way, let's get into the law. You'll recall that the year was 1750 BC, which is significant because the letter coincides with the last year of King Hammurabi's rule. King Hammurabi is that guy who wrote that famous law code. Hammurabi's code makes extensive mention of punishments for merchants and agents who have gone rogue. You could only imagine. You got these hired guns, essentially mercenaries, transporting a ton of precious metals that are worth a lot of money. There is a substantial risk that they would run off with the silver, but to combat that, it seems like they were well paid and well fed. Interestingly, the salesmen sometimes put their expenses into the sales contract, saying, I paid X amount of money for the wagon and X amount of money for the messenger's food. In this way, they were saying, hey look, I'm not price gouging, my price is marked up because I have to pay for all these shipping costs, which makes sense for transparency purposes. And so, pursuant to the contract, these well-paid and well-fed messengers would show up with silver and an empty wagon, exchange the silver for goods, load up the wagon, and go home. Although that may sound simple, it was actually a legal necessity. Hammurabi's code specifies that a contract is not created unless that exchange takes place. Without that exchange, there was no way to enforce it. That's like me saying to you, hey, remember when we were drunk at the bar 3 years ago and you said you would give me your house? Under Hammurabi's code, that does not fly. I do not get your house because there was no exchange and no contract. That same rule applies today, except the exchange is now called consideration by the courts, which is boring and really not germane to this conversation. Anyway, other than the exchange requirement, Hammurabi's laws are remarkably silent on the issue of contracts. We know that there's got to be an exchange, but that's pretty much it. But the reason for that is because contract law, even today, isn't statutory. It's based on precedent. Here's some fun legal stuff for you. There are two sources of law as we know them: statutory law, which is written down, and common law, precedent. Statutory law is the stuff that Hammurabi's code is known for. If you take somebody's eye out, we're going to take your eye out. If you take somebody's hand off, we're going to take your hand off. If you eat a watermelon on Tuesday, we're going to kill you, etc., etc., etc. Today, statutory law makes up the majority of our criminal and tax codes and the same stuff it was used for way back then. Common law is all the other stuff that the court deals with. Like people make contracts, they sue for breaches of those contracts, and then the courts are forced to issue a decision based on the contents of the contract on a case-by-case basis, rather than relying on some outside body of law for guidance. They then use those decisions, most of the time which are rooted in fairness and justice, to build a body of law. We know that Bronze Age societies had specific courts that dealt with contracts. If there was a problem with the contract, the issue would go to court, or if it was valuable enough, it would go to the king. Once the case was brought, the litigants would have to summon their witnesses. We have a letter from around this time doing exactly that. Thus says Urlagal, tell Enema that Orsippada Ninadima and the wife of Uniel the priest are my witnesses. Tell the city governor to seal a document and press the case to court. So the parties would then bring their witnesses to the temple where their contracts were recorded, and then have the witnesses take an oath to the gods to tell the truth, because to lie and commit perjury were punishable by death under Hammurabi's code. The case would then be heard. These witnesses were generally a requirement. Without them, the case would be thrown out. Assuming you had the requisite evidence and you were successful in your lawsuit, you had a couple of options. The other party could be assessed a fine, or, let's say the person owed you a lot of money, you could have them thrown into jail. Another remedy for the debt would be debt slavery, taking your debtor or his family or his slaves hostage and making them work it off. But this all begs the question, do you really need to sue? Let's say you have a bad experience at a store. You're hosting a big barbecue and you realize you don't have potato chips, so you go down to the local Walmart and see that they're having a 2-for-6 sale on Lay's barbecue potato chips. You pick up 6 bags and you head over to the cash registers. The cashier looks you up and down, takes a long pause, and says, "Sir, are you sure you need all those potato chips?" You are now offended and heavily incensed at this minimum wage worker. But is the answer to sue him? No. Generally, you slam them with a bad review on Yelp or Facebook and then never go there again. More relevantly, let's say you order a shirt online and have it shipped to the store for pickup. You paid when you ordered it, but then when you go to pick it up, you realize that the computer screen didn't accurately portray the color of the shirt. You wanted a maroon shirt, but in person, the shirt was bright pink. You inspect it and decide that you want a refund because this shirt is giving off vibes that you didn't really want to give off. Today, in the law, this is called the right of rejection. You inspect goods on arrival and either accept or reject them. The people in the Bronze Age had this figured out 5,000 years ago, and that's why Nani's first resort was to write Ea Nasir an angry letter. But what's important to note, and the reason that I think that Ea Nasir wasn't exactly a bad guy, is because no matter what the circumstances were, Nani never would have been able to sue Ea Nasir. But more on that momentarily. Now that we have an idea about how trade worked and how the laws of the time operated, let's apply it to good old Nani's letter, line by line. I hope that you will see that Ea Nasir is not the villain that the internet makes him out to be. Line 1. When you came to me, you said, I will give Gimmelson fine quality copper ingots. So again, we know that Ea Nasir went to Dilmun in Arabia, got copper, and then would ship it back to Ur for sale. A merchant, Nani the Aggrieved, had previously spoken to Ea Nasir and agreed to purchase fine quality copper from him. It also appears that Nani deposited money with Ea Nasir at that time, meaning he paid in advance. With the payment, we have creation of the contract as required by Hammurabi's code. We also know that they have done business in the past because Nani had already purchased over 1,000 pounds of copper from Ea Nasir. Line 2. You left then, but you did not do what you promised me. You put ingots that were not good before my messenger and said, paraphrasing, take it or leave it. So Nani's messenger arrives, sees that the copper is absolute slag garbage, and refuses to complete the purchase. He goes home without any copper, but Ea Nasir doesn't give Nani his money back. We call that a breach of contract, and generally theft. Line 3 is just Nani complaining. What do you take me for that you treat me with such contempt? Blah, 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 blah. Line 4, though, I want you to pay attention to. Is there anyone among the messengers that deal with Dilmun that has treated me in this way? You alone treat my messenger with contempt. All on account, pay attention, of that one trifling mina of silver which I owe you. You feel free to speak to me in such a way. These, ladies and gentlemen, are the lines that blow it all apart for me. This is precisely why I am Team Ea Nasir. I'm a member of a Facebook group called Let's Pretend It's Bronze Age Internet, where people write funny things about the Bronze Age. There's also a subreddit called Really Shitty Copper with almost 50,000 subscribers. In both, Ea Nasir comes up every day and is painted to be this horrific copper miser, evil creature from hell. I want to argue to the contrary. Now bear with me, because I'm about to do a lot of sketchy math to justify my position. We know that in the century preceding Hammurabi, when the laws of Eshnunna were still in effect in that city, that 3 minas of copper were worth 1 shekel of silver. We do not know what they were worth in Hammurabi's time. The code does not say. Nor do we know how much it was worth in the city of Dilmun, where Ea Nasir got the copper, meaning that it could have been worth more or less than it was in Babylon. We also don't know if the copper was raw or refined, or whether the prices set by the laws, assuming there was one, was for commodity traders or end users. What we do know is that 1 shekel of silver is worth 1/60th of a mina. So if you use the values in Eshnunna's laws and plug them into the Nani and Ea Nasir equation, we find that 1 mina of silver is worth 180 minas, 225 pounds, of copper. 180 minas of copper is practically 1/10 of what Nani has already deposited in the temple on Ea Nasir's behalf. Remember that Nani probably took out what was essentially a business loan from the temple of Shamash and/or had his contract for the purchase of copper recorded there. Also remember that Nani paid Ea Nasir directly in silver. Based on the letter, we know that Nani's account with the temple was in good standing, because he and Sumiabum deposited the same amount of copper there. But the fact that the letter references Nani owing Ea Nasir a mina of silver, when you have identical amounts of copper deposited in the temple, says to me that at some point in the past, Nani shortchanged Ea Nasir by 1 mina of silver. In other words, he did not pay for 225 pounds of copper in a prior transaction. Still, Ea Nasir performed and provided him with that copper anyway. So when he does this new shipment, Ea Nasir says, you know what, if you don't like the copper, fine, but I'm keeping your money because you owed me a lot anyway. In other words, Nani was the jerk first. And that is why Nani was forced to write an angry letter and could not have possibly appeared at the temple of Shamash with his witnesses, including Sumia Bum, to punish Ea Nasir. Based on the letter and what we know, Nani himself would have been punished if he sued Ea Nasir and if Ea Nasir decided to push it. Ea Nasir could have easily walked free and had Nani as a debt slave if the court took his side. With all of that said, although I'm on Ea Nasir's side for this particular transaction with Nani, it is obvious that he was a horrible copper merchant, because this is not the only letter that we have. Archaeologists found Ea Nasir's house. In it, there were several other complaint letters addressed to him regarding his subpar quality copper ingots. What it looks like, and I alluded to this earlier, is that his copper business went downhill pretty fast. He was forced to move back to the city of Ur, where he started trading in cheaper goods like textiles, wool, etc., etc., etc. His once large house became split between another family, so there was a wall put up essentially where it wasn't supposed to. So we know that he had sold part of it off, presumably to pay off some debt to the government or taxes or something. The other letters go something like this. Thus says Imgerson to Ea Nasir, transfer good copper to my messenger. Give him good copper so that I will not become upset. Don't you know that I'm weary? Clearly written by somebody who has previously dealt with his shenanigans. Another letter says, give Ingilson, my messenger, very good copper. Hopefully the copper in your care has not gone out. Again, the letter emphatically demands good quality copper, hinting that he previously got bad quality copper. But we also have another letter from Ea Nasir addressed to somebody else. It's in the British Museum and translations are sparse and they kind of all say different things. But the caption says that it's a letter from Ea Nasir and Elushu Elashu to Shamun Ibishi and Separum Pater, telling them not to fear the arrival of two other men. Advice was given to take them both to the Shamash temple, the same temple as Nani's contract was recorded in, and have them make an oath. Based on the translation that we have and the other letters that we have in our collection, it looks like Ea Nasir is either defending or initiating some sort of legal action. Hopefully one day we get a more accurate translation. And with that, we end my take on the Ea Nasir letter. Please keep in mind, I'm not a historian and I'm not an archaeologist. I'm just a lawyer who finds these ancient things fascinating. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you hated it, I'm sorry. For the non-haters, please be sure to tune in again to learn more about the laws of history.